welcome to the Fairhope History session sponsored by the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation. I'm Kurt Cochran, a member, and I'm glad to be here to welcome you and also to introduce your speaker. And you're in for a rare treat tonight. There's a very nice short biography of her in the pamphlet, a little bit of history, so I won't say too much about that. But Pinky Bass is a woman that I met soon after I moved here 4 years ago, and I was always amazed by the name, and I was really disappointed to know that that really isn't her real name. But she's been associated with Fairhope all of her life, and her family has been here since the turn of the century, so she has a lot of stories if she didn't experience them herself. And she's a photographer. And another fascinating thing about her, she does pinhole camera photography, and the pinhole camera is about big enough to fill up a pickup truck bed. It's quite a feat in itself. I'm just amazed by that. And I'm not anxious to learn, actually, so I want to ask you to teach me. But she's going to share her family stories and memories of Fairhope tonight. Without further ado, Pinky Bass.
Just by introduction, I want to say, to me it's interesting that the history of places very often are about the stories that are told. And what happens very often is that stories aren't true, or either they're a little bit off or not quite right, but over time they become part of history, and they're accepted as fact when they may or may not be. Every time I've given this talk, I've learned something new, and I've changed my talk to meet those situations. So stories are very interesting. I'm always interested in other people's stories about Fairhope and other parts of their lives. And my Aunt Ruth was the one who wrote down most of this information, but she was constantly being disputed and corrected by her two sisters. So this thing has evolved, and there's still lots of questions I have about what really went on. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about whether the family stories are truth, memory, or fiction, and I'm pretty sure a couple of them I know are fiction. And I will continue to try to, okay, let me figure out which thing I'm going to use this. I will try to be as accurate as possible. So it turns out that my sister and I came during World War II to Fairhope while Daddy was overseas. My mother worked as a draftsman in Mobile. And so we moved in with my grandmother on Bayview, which was where, at that point, that was the family home. It was Uncle Gene's house. But so we moved to Fairhope, and of course, somebody asked me in one of the school pictures why we had on kind of military clothes. Well, we were being supportive of Daddy and being over in the war. So that was what that was all about. The stories are numerous that we have. Primarily, like right here, if you can see in the corner, there's a dog. This is a photograph that my grandmother made. And one of the stories, this is Grandma Harford, and you kind of get an idea of what type of personality she was by that look on her face. She's a very serious lady. Well, the story that was written down was that Aunt Ellen's black Cocker Spaniel, called Dash, was always barking, and Grandma Harford was trying to make it stop. So she decided to dress up as a man in men's clothing. Dash bounded out, and she took a swipe at him, and he just turned around and left. And the family joke was, yeah, Grandma Harford learned something, but the dog didn't learn a thing. So, the family actually came from Verona. They had lived in the Rogue River Valley in Oregon before that, where they had been operating a sawmill. And then it turns out that Grandma Harford was worried about living in such an uncivilized country. So she decided, because of Valley and Fannie Mae, the two children of her two grandchildren, that they should move to a more civilized country, and that was when they moved to Verona. Now, during this time, Valley and Fannie Mae were not always well, and that was part of the reason for the movement. I understood, in fact, those two girls died within 9 days of each other once they moved to Illinois, because it turned out that they had diphtheria. And that was a very sad occurrence. I had always thought that this story, I found out last time, was about my Aunt Nell and my grandmother Lois, who's on the right. and that it was recorded by Aunt Nell. I always thought it was about those two, but it turned out it was about Dally and Fannie Mae, but it turns out it was actually about Aunt Nell. Aunt Nell and her cousin Jessie, and the story goes that they wandered, they were warned not to wade in Walpecan Creek, which is in Verona. One day they slipped off and were wading in the creek. They looked up and saw an Indian. That did it. They headed home, and for a long time they did not venture near the creek. Turns out it was Grandma Harford dressed up as an Indian, and this time her efforts proved helpful. One of the interesting things to me is that my family, Grandpa Slosson was a Union soldier, and it turned out he was wounded the day after the war ended over at Blakely. He was there, and this is a photograph on the right of his company when they had a reunion. He and Uncle Gene, or Uncle Fred, excuse me, invested in land in Baldwin County for the purpose of raising sheep. And Grandma and Grandpa Slosson were to share the work and share the profits. In a minute I'll show you what that is. But what is interesting to me is that he was so intrigued with this part of the world that after the war, eventually this is where they decided to come, and that was a big part of what made him decide that. The property they brought was not this. This was the first house they lived in. But the property they brought was actually in Baldwin County, and I'll show you a map in a minute. The interesting thing was that they came to raise sheep, and Grandma and Grandpa Slosson were to share in the work and in the profit. That was of the profits from the work. The original tract of land was 14,000 acres. The deed to the land, known as Rupert land, read 20,000 acres, more or less. That was written in the deed. But this was the house that they moved into when they first came. It was on Fish River, and they boarded at first with a family called Waldees. I don't know if anybody knows the Waldees, but that's another thing I'm curious about. Uncle Fred didn't like the food, which consisted mostly of cornbread, turnip greens, and salt pork. So Grandma said if they could find a place and get her a few utensils, she could manage to do the cooking. So they located and moved to a cabin near Fish River. This cabin, the Slossons lived in for about 5 years, was one of the best houses in the area at the time. I look at that and think, wow. The cabin originally had dirt floors, and Grandma cooked at the fireplace, and they slept on pine needle mattresses. So those of you that are familiar with Silverhill, you go out 104 and come to Silverhill here. But before you get to that, Highway 49 goes this way, and I haven't checked out the amount of property, but this is pretty much the general property that they bought, and the house was right there on 49, and I'm going to show you some pictures in just a minute of that. But that's the background of how the family got down here. They were looking. There was information about Silverhill, and they decided to come down and look, and that was how they managed to get down here. Now, up above, that's the picture of my grandmother and Aunt Nell, her sister, and their parents, and the house below is the one that they built on that road on 49. There are a million stories about what went on in that house. I'll give you a few of them. I won't bore you with all of them. But this is one I love a lot. In 1897, in need of food, they killed a pig. It was cold weather. They dressed it and hung it out by the water tank house by the windmill, and they expected to take it into the tank house. When they went out to get it, it wasn't there. The gimlet that had been thrown over into the lane, and a search began. Sure, someone had stolen it. Mr. Kinney, and I don't know who Mr. Kinney is, but anyway, Mr. Kinney made the report. When Grandma and Grandpa went to bed, they found the pig under the bed. Mr. Kinney had found a frantic grandma, told her to just hold on, knowing all the while just exactly where it was. Another story I've loved is about a man named Alec Fuller, who came from Illinois, loved mushrooms, and he loved seeing them growing in the yard, and every day he would come out and gather them. At one time there were none to be found, and Grandma Slosson stayed up half the night covering orange halves with muslin, put them in the yard at night, so when Fuller got up, they were there. To his surprise, they were actually mushrooms. Crazy family. I love it. So the one on the left, of course, shows it after the trees had begun to grow. The one on the right was made maybe a year ago. Curiously enough, I played in a bluegrass group and discovered that the banjo player, Tom Easley, his aunt, Swoboda, was one who lived in the house at that time. And very generously, she invited me to come in and walk the perimeter. I mean, it's just one of those solid Swedish houses, you know, it's four square. This is another story, one more. Once at the Slosson home, two itinerant preachers spent the night with the folks. They were, and I say this in quotes, some off-brand religious sect was how they was described. I don't mean that as an insult. Anyway, and then they said maybe Latter-day Saints or Holy Rollers. I don't know. I've got a whole family full of Pentecostals, so I'm not saying this is a negative thing. Anyway, after supper, as they sat around the fire, the preachers announced that they'd like to have a prayer. Doug Renner, who was a visitor from up north, knew that if there was any sort of commotion, Primrose, another one of the dogs, would start barking. One little whistle or quick movement and Primrose started barking. And Doug got her so upset that she barked and barked. He had a police whistle, and when he blew it, Primrose barked the loudest. He kept the dog barking until the preachers gave up on prayer. Funny people. Now, I think you all may have seen some of these pictures. The one on the left is Frank Stewart, the picture man, washing his photographs in Polecat Creek. And the one on the top is actually the entrance to the Stewart property. That might be Primrose, actually. That's interesting. Anyway, I'm pretty well convinced that Stewart was the one that taught my grandmother photography, because the first picture I showed you of my grandmother and Aunt Nell with their parents was a photograph made by Stewart. And their property was right next to theirs in that area. Eventually, they moved to Fairhope, down on the right, and basically about the same time that my grandparents moved into Fairhope. So I'm pretty sure there was a real strong connection there. One of my favorite Stewart stories is about Mr. Edel. It turns out that Mr. Edel, who had moved up from Florida, asked Stewart to make these photographs so he could send to his friends and show them how hard his wife was making him work in Fairhope. So those of you that have heard the name Edel, now you know. Up at the left is my grandmother, Lois. At that point, it was Lois Slosson. Her photograph of the old lumber railroad over in Silverhill, or wherever it was they took the lumber, is up there. And what I ended up inheriting was like 150 glass negatives that were the photographs that she had made. And so the railroad, to me, the railroad picture is just, it's iconic. I just love it. Down at the bottom is someone whose name I don't know. I do know I love that picture of the woman standing in the rose garden. I just think my grandmother obviously had a good eye, and that began to show in the photographs she made. Up at the left is actually my grandmother with her pet cow. And you remember I said something about the windmill, and that's all that's out at Silverhill. I like to believe that Aunt Nell, who of course, as I've said, was blind, or did I say it yet? She was blind. Anyway, Aunt Nell, probably, I'm guessing my grandmother set up the picture and then she pressed the button so that the picture could be made. There could be other explanations, but my grandmother's also in the one down at the bottom, and she's the one pulling the wagon, so someone else had to actually, push the thing. But my grandmother did all the developing and work with the photographs. So the family, what the business was, they came to raise sheep, but there were issues with that. But they ended up doing a sawmill, having a sawmill, and the logs were put into Polecat Creek and then went down to Fish River and then were shipped off to wherever it was they needed to go. And I think my all-time favorite picture that my grandmother made was of the sheep shearers who came to work in their fields. There's something about that photograph with the way the light's coming in the barn and the sheep actually there, and I don't know, I think it's pretty amazing that she did that. Another person that was real important in her life was Minerva Healed, the lady up here. She worked for my great-grandmother, and evidently her husband I don't know whether he got drunk or what, but she didn't want to take home the money, all of the money that she earned, and so she asked my grandmother to keep it for her. And then when she needed something, she would come and my grandmother would give her some of the money. So Minerva Hill is her name. I've been trying to find some relatives, but that would be over in Silverhill. I haven't found anybody yet. Below, you see, that's Grandpa Slosson and Grandma Slosson, who would be my grandmother's parents. And the goat pulling the cart is called Grover Cleveland. Now, I don't know whether that was a political statement or a personality statement, whether it was a stubborn goat or what, but I've always loved that picture of them. When the Slossons and Sundbergs moved into Fairhope, one of the issues was getting across the bay. There was no causeway, there was no way to just drive there, so the bay boats had to be used. And this was Grandpa Sundberg with the car, the family car, and it was going to be loaded onto the bay boat to go across to Mobile. What happened was, during the time when my grandmother was young, they had to find a way to educate, well, first of all, to educate Aunt Nell, who, as I said, was blind, and they found a music teacher, and she learned violin. She went to Mobile and studied violin. My grandmother went to Barton Academy, the picture down in the bottom, and that was where she got her education. And so they would go and spend the whole week in Mobile, and then come back to Fairhope on the weekends to be with the family. So I just always thought that was pretty amazing. These are some pictures that my grandmother made in Mobile. The old courthouse in Mobile, I just think that's sort of an iconic picture. Oops, I didn't mean to do that yet. Okay, there. I love the picture of the bobbies walking down the street, and the fact that it looks like horse that they're getting ready to walk into. I don't know. I've often wondered about that, but you can recognize some of the signs. And then below, this was in 1900 or 1901. I've researched it a little bit and still have not determined which year of Mardi Gras, but there are about 15 slides of Mardi Gras that my grandmother made in 1900 or 1901. I'm not sure which, but that's what these are. My grandmother evidently, remember I showed you over there, so Silverhill's there, and so this was the property where my grandmother's, all of the family was. And then just around the corner on 48 was a house that turned out to be the home of my grandfather, Sundberg, and the house is still there. I put this picture, when I first came back to Fairhope, I couldn't identify who these people were. I couldn't figure it out. Put this picture in the Fairhope Courier to see if anybody knew who it was, and then discovered later, oh yeah, that's my family. I was just like, oh, okay. We learn things the hard way sometimes. But so evidently my grandmother and Reuben Sundberg met while they were surveying the land. Evidently the women in my family participated as much in the business side of things as the men did. So I thought that was pretty wonderful. So the family comes to Fairhope, and this, to give you an orientation, so this is where we are at the library, and this, Fairhope Avenue, this is Magnolia, and then Bayview goes off there. This is called Boyce Lane, not Boise, it's Boyce, and Atkinson Lane there. And so the houses and some of the history I'm going to be showing you will be in those areas, and I've got a map that goes with some of them later so you can see. So what happened was, when they came to Fairhope looking to buy property, the story was that Grandma Slosson was getting pneumonia from bringing the motherless lambs in from the field. Now that's, whether it's true or not, that's the story, and we're stuck with it. But I love it. And so they came to Fairhope to try to find a better way to live. The house up in the left corner was pretty much how the house was when they came. They were in there for something like, I think about 20 years, but in the meantime, they were building houses across the street and back. I'll show you those in just a minute. But so basically, well, this is the family sitting on the front porch. We now know, that Bonnie Holt and Andy lived in the house, and then eventually now Allison and her husband live in the house, and you can see how it's changed. But I love, and it's called the Columns. That's what people normally call it, and it's located as as the map shows you there. Across the street, directly across the street, is the house. The upper right shows what it pretty much looks like now. It's where the Stapletons live. But initially, it was a house that was built by let's see now, I always get it mixed up. It was built by the Sundbergs for the Slosson. The two families, eventually my grandmother and Reuben married, but the families kind of seemed to move around together, and they worked together in the sawmill. So my niece seems to think that the Woodlawn Dairy folks lived in that house at some point. We couldn't find any proof of it at the colony, so I don't know that it's true, but she seems to think that was definitely the situation. But, okay, so there's the house, and then right next door, right there, is a little work shed. So that's the corner house that I was just showing you, and the Columns was across the street from that, and then this was the work shed where they worked. Well, eventually it had an apartment upstairs. It actually had stairs that went up the side, and this was an apartment, and they still had the workshop below, but then eventually they turned the whole thing into apartment, and this is pretty much what it looks like now. So here's where the Columns would be, and this is like in between the two houses that are there. So it was a very wonderful way of being able to live and work, where you were. Aunt Nell, if I didn't mention before, was blind. She was blind from age 11. It turns out that evidently this is another one of the stories. I don't know what the real truth is, but somehow a stick hit her in the eye and caused her to go blind in one eye, and then I guess an infection or something led to the other eye. So basically, one eye was a glass eye. She was generous enough to take it out and let us as girls look at it. And the other eye, she could barely, if the sun was bright, she could tell it was a bright sunny day. But we're talking about a woman, well, she loved her cats for one thing, but this is a very, very talented woman. She studied violin, she sang at the Christian Science Church for a long time. She played piano, she listened to books on tape. She was much more informed than any of us in the family. She was knitted and crocheted. We found her diary at one point, and she would talk about so-and-so had just come in from the country and said, would she make a shawl for Aunt so-and-so? She would do these kinds of things. She was just and so what happened was, which I thought was really interesting, they kind of wanted her to get an education. They wanted her to go to Chicago to study. She went up, first she went to Talladega, and she was there for a part of one quarter, I think, and she came back home and she said, I don't live with unsighted people. I don't live with blind people. I live with sighted people. I don't want to learn how to live in that community. So that was the end of that little particular thing. But basically, then another time she was offered to be able to go to school in Chicago to play the violin, but she didn't want to leave the family. So she's just, I don't know, she's an absolutely amazing woman to me. And behind her, and she lived in that little cottage that was the workshop for a long time. And behind that, this little house that's over on Magnolia is either, here again, this is one of these things we're not sure, it's either Clarence Darrow's aunt's house. Michael Patrick said he had heard that the sister lived in a house that faced the park, Knoll Park. So I'm not real sure. Somebody else told me they thought really that it was Upton Sinclair who lived in the house, or at least came to visit there. Upton Sinclair actually gave my Aunt Nell turquoise bracelet and ring, and it's just amazing to know that they had all these connections over these years that was happening. So then, next, on the other side of the workshop, so the workshop's here and the one on the corner. So this was where Uncle Gene was building a house, and ultimately that became, for us, the family home. The other houses got sold or or changed for one reason or another. So basically, as you can see, it's just this square thing. The Schlesingers live in the house now. This is my mother and father. When Aunt Ruth died, I went back to graduate school when I was 50, and then I moved. After graduate school, I didn't have anywhere to go, so I thought Aunt Ruth might let me come stay with her, which she did. And I was dying to come back to Fairhope anyway. And when I got, she would live maybe 2 or 3 years after I moved back, and then when she died, my mother just was not willing to give up the house. It had too full of memories and junk. I mean, it's, you know, everything was, you know, still there. We're big collectors of things. So they moved into the big house, and I moved into the little garage apartment, which worked out just perfect for all of us. But, I skipped a really big important thing. Okay, I'm going to say it even though the pictures, the columns, the house that's the columns, I wanted to read you what was in the papers about that house. And Allison got this information for me. It says, I hereby convey the following property: the house, barn, pump, connection with waterworks, fence, and all improvements on the lot, because it was a single tax property, leased from Fairhope Single Tax Corporation, together with the furniture in said house. The receipt of $2,200 in the payment of same is hereby acknowledged. And the funniest part was that my grandfather, when he came to the house, that would be Grandpa Slosson, who was also a doctor. And when he came to the house, he was wearing his blue jeans. He had been in the sawmill. He was wearing his work clothes. And he walked up to the front door, and Mr. Mogg, who owned the house at the time, looked at him and says, "You can't afford this place." And it made him furious. And he went to the bank and got the money. And what is interesting to me is that this deed was signed over to my grandmother, Cornelia Slosson, rather than to him. So, as I said, they came to share the work and share the cost. It was the way that the thing worked. So, one of our family traditions has always been to take photographs on the back steps. Over the years, we have hundreds of photographs. So, anytime any of us came to visit Fairhope, I left after World War II. We moved to Knoxville, and so, but I would come back every summer, every Christmas, every possible time to visit. So that became kind of one of our family rituals that was important. During World War II, the first house that we came to after Daddy left to go overseas was the little house on Atkinson Lane. Now you'll recognize it as this one. My grandmother actually put it together with all the odd pieces of materials that were left over from the other houses. None of the windows are the same size, the doors are all odd, but she just put it together. And that was, I loved that house. We didn't stay there long because I think it just was more convenient for us to be in my grandmother's house. And so then we moved on back down to Bayview. But that house is still there. So, and Wheezy Dancroft made the thing on the side. Then on Magnolia is this house that was actually, this is from the early days, it was built for the Slossons to live in. And ultimately, Aunt Nell married, at age 40, my Aunt Nell married. And she married Mr. Boyce. That's why I insist, people have got to learn to say Boyce instead of Boise. His name was Seymour Boyce, and the lane is named for him. But Mike Smith and, what's her name? Yes, own the house, yeah. And they've taken wonderful care of. And Mr. Boyce, he did a lot of work, and this was his workshop out in the back. I think they fixed it up as kind of a guest cottage or something now, but it was a wonderful house. What was interesting about it, well, two things. This is Aunt Nell with Mr. Boyce. He was somewhat older than she was, and he also played in the band. Here he is in the center. Aunt Nell couldn't play in the band because she couldn't see to read the music. You have to be able to see to read the music. But they were in that house for a number of years until Mr. Boyce died, and then she moved back down to the little garage apartment that I eventually lived in. Shortly after my grandmother started having children, they ended up moving to Mobile and building houses there on Park Avenue and another street I can't remember right now. But anyway, Grandpa Slosson, who, as I said, was also, in addition to being a manager of the lumber mill, was also a doctor, but he was a homeopathic doctor. One of my favorite stories about him was that a young man came to him and said, "Oh, I've broken my leg, fix my leg." And he said, "Well, I can't because I'm not licensed, but I can tell you what to do." And he explained it to him thoroughly, and the boy fixed his leg, and he was fine. He got along just great. So, but anyway, this is my mother and her sister and brother, two sisters and brother. My Uncle Edwin never liked these pictures. He said it makes us look like we were poor and raggedy. Well, that's just how people dressed, you know. I love it. I think it's really cool. And of course, many of you probably heard the story about the Sarah Jane. Dr. Marion actually owned that car initially and sold it to Grandpa Slosson. And for some reason or other, they had trouble stopping it. One time when they came to Fairhope, they had to lasso a tree, and it went round and round and round until it finally stopped. Another time when they were going to Silverhill, they evidently went straight through town and the thing wouldn't stop, and they had to keep going until it ran out of gas. And they never quit teasing them about that. I also really love this one at the bottom of them it's not the same car, in another car, but with a Fairhope banner, and they were on their way down to the bay. Now, in the back seat, we have Aunt Nell and my grandmother driving, and Uncle Edwin, all the kids. Anyway, they were headed down to the bay. What was, to me, was just absolutely wonderful was that Aunt Nell was the person who was in charge of the children when they went to the bay. She would walk down to the bay with them, and it was her responsibility to take care of them. So the picture on the left is Aunt Nell with all four of them down at the bay, and then on the right, someone told me that was Mrs. Middleton in that picture, but I don't know her connection to the family. And anybody that knows anything later can tell me about Mrs. Middleton. But, you know, they've actually got a crab in the dip net. I mean, that was the only way to do it, was to use a dip net as far as I was concerned. That was the way you crabbed. My grandmother became Marietta Johnson's first trained teacher. She went off and got training, and that would be, oops, I keep pushing the wrong thing, okay. That would be she right there. And we've identified a lot of their Dysons and Correys, and a lot of, they're people that we recognize. Somebody said they thought that, I think it's the boy whose head's turned down, might be Upton Sinclair, that he came sometimes and went visited the school. I don't know, but it's nice to think that might be true. The picture below shows my grandmother with one of those big philodendron leaves, and Aunt Ruth has written on one of the cards that it's her, and my mother insists it's not, that it's my mother. It's not Aunt Ruth, so who knows, but it doesn't matter. And of course, the whole thing of the organic school, how wonderful it was to be able to play and to learn with playing. Now, this is one of my big confessions, and I will live with the with the story. Presumably, Grandma Slosson brought kudzu and planted it in that gully that goes up from the bay. And that gully is still there. It has not washed away that part of the bay area. And so, c'est la vie. But I don't know. That may be fiction. Who knows? It's pretty good. The school, during the time when my grandmother was there, these were some of the pictures up at the left. And then down at the right, my Aunt Ruth, that I came to live with later, was a home demonstration agent, and she actually did teacher training with Marietta Johnson. And ultimately, I came, and with my pop-up pinhole camera that I pulled behind the car. So we have 3 generations of us who have taught at the Marietta Johnson School. This is current. Keep wanting to push the old. That was when my grandmother was there, and she's hard to identify, but she's in there. And then this was my pop-up camper thing, and the same Bell building, the same Bell building. So that was fun. And there was a young Dyson in my class, so it's like the beat goes on and on and on. Dot Kane, whom many of you know, was a very important person in that whole world. And after I moved back to Fairhope in the 80s, I said something to her. I was talking to her one day, and I said something to her about, I vaguely remember walking like down from the organic, I went to kindergarten, and I would walk down from the organic school to somebody's house for piano lessons. She said it was me. We had no piano. We had a cardboard that folded out with 2 or 3 octaves on it, and I would practice on the cardboard, and then I would go to her house and get to play on her piano. And clearly, that, you know, some memories, because people told you, that's one I have so clear in my mind, is walking to her house. So that was pretty wonderful to me to be able to do that. Now, this is the first time I've shown these. Joy, is Joy here? I don't think so. Anyway, Joy West was her name at the time, and I were in organic school in kindergarten together. I don't think we actually knew each other, but then Mother and Daddy were afraid when I moved to Knoxville after the war that I wouldn't be able to fit in with the school curriculum, so they put me in Fairhope Elementary. I don't know why Joy was changed to the elementary school, but we met each other in the 3rd grade, or, well, 3rd grade was what I remember the most. She and Dolly and I, Joy, Dolly, and Pinky, how's that for a combination, were best friends in the elementary school. Joy later went on to, went back to organic, and I guess through high school, finished. And her husband that she married, Curtis Willard, worked first of all at the old theater in downtown Fairhope, which is anybody, yeah, some of y'all were here when it, yeah, remember it. But what was more intriguing to me, and which I really loved, was that he was the one that had the theater down, the walk-in theater down at the Bay. And oh my gosh, how I wish that was still down there. I think that would be so wonderful. But this is a picture of Joy and Willard outside of the theater. And I thought, you know, that's the kind of thing. My whole thing about doing this program is there's so many people that are not known, their names are not known in this community necessarily, but have contributed to what kind of a place it is. And I think these people are part of what I'm talking about in that whole process. And that's part of why I really like doing this program, is that most people have never heard of Slossons and Sundbergs. You know, that's just not a name that would come up unless you happen to be in music or, you know, something where their world was. But anyway, so I liked the idea of reminding people of Joy, and Willard, I think, gave, over 2,000 movies on DVD and VHS to the library, which are, I think, have either been, I don't know, they're probably transferring some of them, but anyway, that was his passion. And so now I have come full circle. I'm still on single tax property, but I'm over on School Street, North School Street, around the corner. And after Mother and Daddy died, I realized the house on Bayview was way more stuff than I was interested in dealing with. And so I was fortunate enough to find this property and have been happily living on North School Street and walking to the library ever since. And so I'm leaving you with this. This is I've probably forgotten something that I meant to say, but I'd be happy to take any questions or any reactions or comments that anybody has. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yes, I do. I've got the camera. I have used the camera, and they're 4x5s, and some of them were left up in the house on Magnolia, so they deteriorated pretty badly. But ones that she had kept in boxes and are in good shape. Yeah.
Speed graphic. The camera.
No, it's a name you wouldn't recognize. I can't remember the name of it, but it's just a box, a square box. And it had a device in it, so you put like 5 glass plates in it. You take the picture, and then you turn a knob, and one glass plate falls down, and leaving the other one available. And it's like that. So it's pretty amazing. But I mean, when I went back to graduate school, I went in photography. I had no idea that she'd ever made a photograph, and I came home and Aunt Ruth said, "Would you like your grandmother's camera and glass negatives?" It's like, wow. So yeah. Yeah. And I really think Fairhope, the whole experience of being in Fairhope and the single tax, the whole concept, I hate to see, I think we're losing stuff here. we're turning in, we're not as creative and pushing edges as they were back in the day, and I miss that. I think it's an important element to this community, and I'd like to see us be a little more gutsy sometimes on things instead of, I don't know, my mother used to hate, this is terrible to say, but hate the trash cans that said waste please and had flowers on the top. It was like, that's not Fairhope, but anyway. But we're becoming very cute, and that's wonderful. It's a wonderful place to visit, and I love it that people come, but I think we're losing some stuff in the process with that. That's just me. That's just my rebellious self.
So the kudzu survived in the gully?
It's kept that, when you go down Bayview, that very first gully, and you can go down the steps to the bay where the duck pond is, that gully is intact. And I think if it hadn't been protected, or, if that hadn't happened, it could have washed a big section of that bank away. So I don't know that I don't know. I don't think she planted a lot of it. I don't think she went to every gully and planted it, and then who knows how it spreads, by magic, yeah. But I do, all of the gullies we have, they've got to have some support, yeah, so anyway. Yeah.
Nikki, at one time, there used to be stories about round tables, discussions in that building above where Fairhope Hardware is, and I think that's before your time, too.
Yeah.
But do you know what that group was, or how that came to be? That it's kind of like these things, but they were political, social.
Do you know, Donnie?
Stories about you went upstairs, opened the
Yeah,
door.
I've heard of it, but I don't know much about the history of it. Yeah, because that's, I think there was the Non-Pareil Society of Women that went on in Fairhope, and I'm not sure they read books, I think. There were pockets of things going on. My grandmother, after she quit Marietta Johnson School and her children came, she started the kindergarten table in her own house. So I think there were pockets of that kind of thing going on all the time around Fairhope. Somebody else's hand. Oh yeah, Donnie.
That picture of the Sarah Jane, the car with Dr. Slosson in it, is that Dr. Michon sitting by him?
No, that would be Uncle Gene. Gene Slosson. Eugene. Yeah, no, this was, it was totally bought from Michon. Yeah. Anybody else? I brought some of the old albums if anybody's interested in looking through some of them. I think I've gone up through about the 40s. After we finish here, you're welcome to come up and look at those. And I'd be glad to talk to anybody that's got anything else they need to talk about. Yeah.
What was the theater? What was the medium? Was it live, film?
It was film. Yes.
It was film.
Yeah.
And what year was that?
Okay, I was in elementary school, so that would have been 40s. Cost a dime, yeah. It cost a dime, she said. And you could stay. I mean, if you went in and saw a full movie, you could stay as long as you wanted. You didn't have to leave. Yeah, you could stay all day, which we kind of did. My grandmother used to come get us out of the theater. Yeah.
Wasn't it open air?
The one down on the bay,
did it have a roof?
no, it was open.
It was open, that's what I was thinking, it was totally open air, yeah. I'd love it if that was so. The bishops, Dolly Bishop and Joy, the Willards, they had a room in the house, in the Willards' house, that was a theater room. And they had 9 children each, and their children would all come and they would show movies. Can you imagine what a thrill that would be to be able to see movies, any movies, anytime you wanted. Yeah.
I was going to say I was one of those 9 children.
Oh, hi. I'll never forget the day Dolly walked up behind me and put her arm around me and said, "Let's be best friends." Yeah, I miss her. Huh?
What grade was
It was either third, I think it was third. That was the year Miss Slaughter was our teacher, and I just have real strong memories of that year. Might have been fourth grade, but yeah. But yeah, I'll talk to you later. Yeah, she was an amazing woman. Wow, yeah. I actually got to spend some time with her after I got back to Fairhope, which I was very grateful for. Yeah. Yeah.
Would you mention the pictures you have at the front, if anybody wants to look through them?
Yeah, let's see, I'm not attached to anything. What I've got some here that that are out, that we don't have identification of who it is and where they are. But most of these, Aunt Ruth put these together. And so this one begins at sometime before '07. And the pictures most of them are the ones that my grandmother made or somebody. I mean, she has little decorative edges and stuff. So that album will be there. And then when she was teaching for Marion Johnson, those were, it just, there are a few in the back of each album that go up north because Verona and where the family came from. So there's some of those in the back, but most of the ones in the front are either Silverhill or Fairhope or I was going to tell you about Aunt Nell, what they did about Aunt Nell. The house on Magnolia that Suzanne and Mike had, actually the floor plan is exactly like one in Mobile because the Slosson house in Mobile, they needed a place, at Sundberg house, that Aunt Nell needed to be able to get around in because she was blind. And so they made the floor plan exactly a duplicate of the Fairhope, which I thought that was such a brilliant thing to do. Like that. So yeah, you all are welcome to come up and just look at these. And any other questions or something, I'll be glad to. Okay. Thank you.